What sparked this latest conflict? Put simply, the Iranians are taking advantage of the weak Biden administration, testing it, and at the same time, a power struggle is being played out between those deadly foes, Hamas, Palestinian Jihad, and the Palestinian authorities, following Abbas cancelling elections in the West Bank because everybody knew he was finished and Hamas would win. That's the fuel, but the spark was provided, as both Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo have pointed out, by the Biden administration's antipathy towards Israel, which I spoke about here on Outsiders only the other day, including denigrating Trump's brilliant Abraham Accords, which saw a plethora of peace treaties between Israel and Arab states such as Saudi Arabia. Under Trump, you had peace in the Middle East. Yes, under Trump, you had peace in the Middle East. Under Biden and Harris, you have war, as I and others predicted. But back to Bolton, mealy mouthpiece of the left.
Asking you about Israel, is Mr. Netanyahu exploiting this political crisis? As we know, he's only the acting prime minister because of inconclusive elections. He's worried about losing office because of possible prosecutions he might face, and that whipping up a security situation or allowing a very dangerous security situation to take place may be simply a cynical way of saving himself.
All political leaders in Israel today want Israel to respond to Hamas aggression and to Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians, because this is what every country would have done.
Not in the way that is going on.
No, in a way. Actually, some people say we're being too gentle. Some people say we're being too gentle.
What a repulsive comment, that it is Benjamin Netanyahu who is whipping up the violence for political purpose. This is sheer Orwellian madness. Meanwhile, I happen to agree with Ambassador Hotovelli. I think Israel is far too gentle, only because it's been so browbeaten by its own lovies and cowards and moral relativists and leftists in the UN and elsewhere. No other country would be so generous to those who wish to annihilate them. In my opinion, Israel should do, and I suspect will do, what any other sensible nation would do: take back Gaza and wipe out Hamas. Forget the endless hand-wringing and the frankly anti-Semitic Israel bashing and Jew hatred that permeates our mainstream media, the ABC, Labour, the Greens and the left. The story of the last 70 years of Israel is summed up in this one photo: a small, technologically advanced democracy constantly having to defend itself from vicious assault sponsored by the Arab regimes and Islamist fanatics that surround it, encouraged and funded by globalist bodies like the United Nations and the European Union and the neo-Marxists of the West. Time and time again, Israeli leaders have offered land and peace to the Palestinians and have been viciously knocked back at every turn, even when they have defended themselves from the invading Arab armies. Israel has then handed back the land that it needed to take to defend itself. Foolishly, in my opinion. I wouldn't have. They should have kept the lot. And the irony: those missiles attacking Israel from the right of that picture are being launched from the very ground that Israel handed over to the Palestinians at enormous personal cost to thousands of Jews and their families, in order to create an atmosphere of trust and to bring about peace with the Palestinians. How tragically naive and ironic. As Ted Cruz pointed out this week, we are on the verge of a shooting war in the Middle East, thanks to the policies of the American left led by Joe Biden.
Very concerned. Hamas is raining rockets down on the people of Israel. They're doing it with the financial support and backing of Iran, of the Ayatollah Khamenei. And this is the result of foreign policy mistakes, enormous blunders by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. You know, you think about it, the last 4 years, President Trump stood strongly with Israel, unequivocally with Israel. We moved our embassy to Jerusalem, something I urged the president to do, and he agreed with me and did. And it produced this oasis of peace. We saw the Abraham Accords. We saw Arabs and Israelis making peace agreements together for the first time in decades. What happened? Joe Biden comes in, immediately begins undermining Israel, immediately begins sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority, to Hamas, the terrorists there, immediately begins negotiation to send billions of dollars to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who regularly chants death to America and death to Israel. And it is producing, we are on the verge of a shooting war in the Middle East because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris undermine our friends and want to send money to our enemies.
Or, as Mike Pompeo, who has appeared here on Outsiders, succinctly put it, it matters who leads. As Donald Trump said this week, when Trump was in office, Israel's adversaries knew that the United States stood strongly with Israel and there would be swift retribution if Israel was attacked. Under Biden, the world is getting more violent and more unstable. And, says Trump, America must always stand with Israel and make clear that the Palestinians must end the violence, terror and rocket attacks, and make clear that the US will always strongly support Israel's right to defend itself. That was Trump speaking. Anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone who tries to pin the blame for this tragedy on Israel, anyone who bangs on about Israel being the oppressor and being some evil apartheid state, such as we saw yesterday at the pro-Palestinian rallies in Sydney and Melbourne, is a dangerous fool and almost certainly an anti-Semite. For decades now, the Palestinian people have suffered at the hands of and been betrayed by their own leaders, encouraged repulsively by the United Nations, the European Union, and obscene amounts of cash from countries such as ours. The Palestinian people themselves have been mercilessly exploited for decades by a succession of Arab dictators, murderous Islamists, and fanatical terror groups who have never lifted a finger to seek genuine peace. In fact, quite the opposite. The Biden administration is desperate to create a Palestinian state, no matter who runs it. But how can Israel ever agree to a two-state solution with people who have sworn in their charter to wipe them off the face of the earth? What's worse, Hamas, who are in a sick competition with the Palestinian Authority to see who can kill more Jews, were no doubt emboldened by those hardcore leftists around the West, including, disgracefully, our own Labour Party, who only a couple of weeks ago loudly proclaimed that the next Australian Labour government will unconditionally recognise a Palestinian state. Unconditionally. Well, we can now see what unconditionally looks like. This, in part, is your Palestinian state, Labour. You helped embolden it. I hope you sleep better in your beds at night than the children cowering under the covers in Lod and Sderot.